The massive steel fortress, whose weight, as the engineers assured, approached an unimaginable 100,000 tons, stood motionless inside the concrete canyon, and I, standing on its edge, felt the cold morning wind creeping under my collar, reminding me that even the greatest creations of human hands remain silent and fragile before the breath of nature. Towering above me were stern walls, as if created not by humans but by the forces of ancient titans, and I couldn't shake the thought that I was witnessing something far more significant than just another engineering stage. I felt as though I were present at the birth of a being destined to change the fate of the seas, and perhaps entire continents. When the operator pressed the button and tens of millions of gallons of water, obeying an invisible command, rushed into the dry dock like a controlled tsunami, the air around trembled, and it seemed to me that even the concrete groaned under the pressure. I watched the mass of water spread out, filling the space, as if bringing to life the giant trough that had remained empty for many years. Only a few hours passed, though it felt like days, and before me, gradually rising from its concrete cradle, began to emerge the colossal ship, longer than 3 football fields, heavy, majestic, as if hanging in the air on invisible chains. I felt a strange, almost childlike excitement growing inside me, for it was the first time I saw a warship of such scale separate from the land, like a giant taking its first breath after a long sleep. In that moment, everything happening ceased to seem like science fiction. On the contrary, reality itself surpassed any invention. Thus, through the movement of water and steel, awakened the weapon of the most powerful fleet ever to exist on American shores. The aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy, the second ship of the Ford class, reached precisely this moment in October 2019, and I, standing among those who witnessed the birth of this steel colossus, felt a pride akin to what one experiences when seeing years of hard work finally take shape and weight. After 4 continuous years of construction, this ship, already called by many the Guardian of Freedom, touched the water for the first time, and in that instant, I realized just how remarkable and complex the journey is for these floating cities, as they move from land to the boundless ocean where they will serve, protect, face storms, and perhaps even engage in battle. That is why today I decided to take you inside this incredible feat of engineering, into those corners rarely seen by outsiders, where drafts carry the smell of metal and grease, where steel rings and hammers pound, and where ships capable of altering the course of history are born. We will begin our journey with the enormous dry docks of Newport News, the very ones that for more than a century have been the home to the birth of America's floating fortresses, and we will move step by step in exactly the order in which I witnessed each event. Deep in Virginia, along the wide and serene James River, lies this remarkable facility, not merely a shipyard, but the only place in the country capable of building nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. When I first set foot on this ground, amid the scent of wet concrete and the distant hum of machinery, it became clear to me that the people working here are not only masters of their craft, but carry a nearly sacred sense of connection to a mission to which their fathers and grandfathers devoted their lives. The essence of everything happening at this enormous shipyard lay in the fact that the very heart of construction was hidden within the massive concrete structures known here as dry docks. And when I first saw their grandeur, I felt like a tiny observer in a colossal workshop of titans. These structures bore no resemblance to ordinary construction sites. They were deep, almost bottomless concrete canyons, designed to hold a ship like the Kennedy through its long journey, from the first welding sparks to its first breath of water. Dry dock number 12, where the aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy was effectively born, stretched more than 2,000 feet in length and 250 feet in width. And looking down at it, I couldn't help but try to imagine how one could fill this enormous space with living, working energy. To grasp the scale, it was enough to picture hundreds of school buses placed side by side, and even then, the imagination faltered, unwilling to contain such an incredible sight. But the real miracle was not even that. What struck me was the very principle of building an aircraft carrier.
It was born not as separate fragments, not as a set of parts to be joined somewhere later. It rose gradually, as if growing from the ground itself as a single continuous structure. Every pipe, every cable, every tiny room was prefigured in the ship's design, and all of it was assembled while the giant stood on massive concrete keel blocks, specially built to bear its enormous weight. These keel blocks, covered with wooden planks, served as the invisible foundations on which the fate of the entire project rested. The carrier weighed almost as much as 800 fully loaded Boeing 747s, and the thought that this mass rested for 4 long years on nothing but rows of concrete supports inspired a deep, almost reverent respect for the people who had built such structures and trusted them without a shadow of doubt. More than 3,200 shipbuilders and about 2,000 suppliers from across the country came together to breathe life into this steel city. As I walked among the workers, watching the steel workers shape the hull, the electricians run endless cable runs, turning a metal skeleton into a living organism, I felt as though I were walking among those who were making history, not with loud words, but with the ringing of hammers, the heat of welding, patience, and skill. Then came the morning when we were all to witness one of the most astonishing transformations, the controlled flooding of the dry dock. The date was October 29th, 2019, and I remember the fresh autumn wind, the smell of wet steel, and the anticipation hanging almost tangibly in the air. The shipyard workers were preparing to witness a rare moment, which made it almost sacred. For the first time, water would touch the Kennedy. But it was not simply a matter of turning valves and letting a rush of water pour in. Flooding the dock resembled a carefully choreographed ballet, where every second, every inch of water's rise was monitored with the precision of a surgical operation. The water first rose only 10 feet, just enough to reach the keel blocks. At that moment, engineers conducted critically important tests, ensuring the system functioned flawlessly, and I saw their focused faces, as if they were holding not metal and machinery, but the fate of a living being. The higher the water rose, the more I sensed an almost magical transformation. The steel giant, motionless for years, began to respond slowly to the touch of buoyancy. The laws of physics asserted themselves, awakening the ship, and I felt as though I were witnessing the first steps of a massive titan preparing to enter the wider world. As the water continued to rise, and the steel colossus gradually felt the gentle, almost cautious embrace of this new force, I noticed in the eyes of the people around that unique mix of pride and anxiety that always accompanies the moments when human labor is handed over to the forces of nature. And although the ship still rested on its keel blocks, it was already clear that relentless buoyancy would begin to claim it, lifting and rocking it, as if inviting it to take its first step. Mike Butler, the program manager for the construction of the Kennedy, stood nearby, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, yet carried a subtle vibration of inner triumphs. He said that flooding the dry dock is always a historic moment, a special milestone in the life of a ship, and for the men and women who worked on this giant, it is not just a stage, but an event that stays with them for a lifetime. I saw many workers who had seen more than one ship built, listening to his words with that quiet agreement peculiar to those who know the true value of hard work. An additional miracle, as the engineers reminded us, was that Kennedy reached this point 3 months ahead of schedule. And although no one outwardly allowed themselves any excess gestures of joy, I felt, beneath the cold wind, beneath the ringing of tools, beneath the heavy smell of water and metal, a hidden vibration of collective achievement, a pride that doesn't shout, but lives quietly and deeply. And when the dock was finally filled with more than 100 million gallons of water, the moment came that, as the old masters said, is never forgotten. The aircraft carrier, which only yesterday had sat motionless on its supports, for the first time felt real, free motion. It no longer depended on concrete blocks. Now it was held solely by the power of the water, by the very element it was destined to conquer for decades. This moment is always called the moment of truth, and I understood why. The giant ship seemed to be testing itself, trying to see how confidently it could remain in the environment created for it. Now it needed to be carefully, almost jewel-like, moved to the western end of the dock. And although the distance seemed ridiculous for such a colossus, every inch mattered. The tugs, the positioning systems, the experienced pilots, all worked in such harmony that they seemed like parts of a single organism whose purpose was the gentle, precise movement of a huge floating city. There was no room for error. The cost of the ship exceeded the economy of some countries, and the thought of this weighed on everyone even slightly involved in the process. I felt this tension almost physically, as if the air around had become denser, as if reacting to people's concentration. And ahead was already looming the christening ceremony, an ancient, almost ritual act connecting generations. And when December finally came, when the day arrived that so symbolically coincided with the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, I found myself among those who watched Caroline Kennedy raise a bottle of champagne to the ship's bow, recreating a moment that had occurred more than half a century before. The crack of glass, silvery spray, a faint echo along the hull, and history closed its circle. And yet, the christening ceremony was only a prelude to a far more complex and almost mystical stage, the moment when the ship would leave its concrete cradle and meet real depth for the first time. After the champagne bottle shattered against Kennedy's bow and the ringing response rolled across the armored decks, a quiet, meticulous preparation for the first movement began. It did not look ceremonial. No fanfares, no loud words, only the focused work of people accustomed to the fact that a ship's fate depends on the precision of their gestures.
I watched as the tugs slowly took their positions, like small but incredibly strong shepherds that were literally about to lead the giant to freedom. They looked like toys next to the aircraft carrier's immense bulk, but each possessed a power that in any other situation they might prefer to conceal. Here, it had to reveal itself fully. When the order to start moving came, the world seemed to compress around a single moment. I already knew that ships of this size do not start with a jerk. They begin to move like living beings, awakening slowly, cautiously, as if checking whether their steel flesh still remembers what it means to float. Kennedy began to slide away from the dock walls so smoothly that at first I didn't believe my own eyes. It seemed that the water was moving beneath it, not it through the water. Despite this almost unreal visual effect, the tug teams worked with furious concentration. Every degree of turn, every foot of distance was tracked by dozens of pairs of eyes and electronic instruments. Even the slightest mistake could cause the steel giant to scrape the dock walls, and the damage would be such that no one wanted to voice it aloud. But the tug pilots, experienced, confident, as if possessing an innate sense of mass and inertia, performed flawlessly. The walls of the dock receded slowly. The air was saturated with moisture and the smell of diesel exhaust, and along with them floated a strange feeling of epochal significance, as if not just a ship was moving toward the exit, but a huge organism that had been growing for many years in a concrete egg was finally about to hatch into the world. When the Kennedy's bow reached the edge of the dock and the vastness of the James River opened before it for the first time, I inhaled as though doing it together with the ship. It looked incredibly majestic, like a skyscraper laid on its side and capable of crossing oceans. And yet, despite its colossal size, at that moment there was something almost timid about it, like a creature taking its first steps into a new environment. The tugs slowly pulled the aircraft carrier into the wide expanse of water, and only when it fully emerged from the concrete walls did something seem to shift within it. It straightened its shoulders, stood taller, as if finally understanding itself not as a construction project, but as a real warship. Its movements became freer, the water beneath it settled differently, and the wind, finally gaining access to its long deck, ran along it as though greeting the new giant. I watched that moment with a feeling that is difficult to describe.
It lay somewhere between pride, awe, and quiet human happiness, the kind that arises when you witness the birth of something truly great. Kennedy was now part of the water, part of the horizon, part of history. But even once on the water, the aircraft carrier was not yet ready to set off on its own voyage. Its journey was only beginning. Now the ship had to make a slow, almost ceremonial transition from the dock to the shipyard's pier, the place where it would spend many more months of finishing work, testing, system adjustments, everything that turns a massive steel frame into a real, fully prepared warship.
The tugs, like attentive guardians, continued leading Kennedy along the shipyard's concrete structures. Their engines worked steadily, heavily, and in their low rumble one could feel a strength directed not toward destruction, but toward support. A strength that knew it was holding in its hands not just a load, but the future of national defense. The water around the aircraft carrier churned slightly, waves spreading from the powerful tug propellers. And these waves seemed to me like a kind of breathing the ship was taking for the first time on its own, testing its balance on the surface. Gradually, we arrived in an area where tall tower cranes, like steel giraffes, froze in anticipation of a new stage of work. They had spent many years lifting, moving, welding, installing thousands of components from which this giant emerged. Now they awaited the moment when they could once again stretch their long necks toward the carrier's decks and superstructures to complete the remaining hundreds of tasks. As Kennedy began approaching the pier, the space around filled with business-like activity. Workers in helmets and safety goggles took their positions along the shore, preparing for mooring. For them, this was not just a technical step. It was a kind of ritual, a transition of the ship into a new phase of life. I saw them coordinating their actions with gestures and short commands, like a long practice choreography requiring precision and trust. Mooring a huge aircraft carrier is an art. Ropes as thick as a human waist seemed alive as they were thrown over bollards and mooring posts. They tightened, creaked, trembled, taking on the weight and inertia of the steel colossus. In that moment, the ship seemed to take its first real exhale, acknowledging that it was stopping temporarily to let people finish the work of its birth. At last, when the final lines were secured and the tug engines fell silent, the space filled with a strange and very quiet music. The gentle rocking of water, the faint creaking of ropes, distant sounds of tools. It was the sound of waiting. Kennedy had taken its new place at the pier, where it would spend long months while engineers and workers, the same ones who had raised it in its concrete nest, completed its formation. And standing there, watching the sunlight slowly settle on its not yet fully completed deck, I felt that this ship had become something greater than just a project. It had become a part of the people who created it, a part of the history it would continue, a part of the sea that had already accepted it, if not yet completely. Now that the aircraft carrier stood at the pier wall, the final stage of its maturation was beginning. A process far less spectacular than flooding the dry dock or that majestic glide into the river, but far more meticulous, requiring patience and hundreds of thousands of precise, almost invisible movements of human hands. Outwardly, it might have seemed that the ship was simply resting after its long transition, but in reality, its inner spaces were full of continuous life. Thousands of specialists returned on board, welders with heavy masks, electricians with bundles of cables, pipe fitters, mechanics, engineers. They spread through countless compartments like blood flowing through the vessels of an organism, filling it with strength and readiness to move. Their footsteps echoed through the metal corridors like a quiet but steady pulse. On the upper decks, installers raised the last sections of railings, setting them with the meticulousness of people who understand that each bolt may one day influence a human life. Inside, in vast compartments resembling laboratories of the future, specialists checked complex cooling systems, power conduits, control units. Somewhere, welding arcs sparked, reflecting blue flashes on smooth metal. Somewhere came the sound of hammers. Somewhere, the calm, businesslike hum of conversations. The ship itself seemed to be listening to every movement. I felt how that ineffable quality was forming within it.
the one that distinguishes a mere collection of mechanisms from a true warship. Character. It was becoming focused, alive, filled with hidden power. It seemed even the river sensed it. The water at the hole quietly lapped, as if respectfully, as if understanding that not just a ship, but a new guardian of the sea horizons was rising nearby. With each passing day, Kennedy gained completeness. Heavy mechanisms came alive under the hands of engineers. Screens glowed with pure white light, and the corridors more and more often echoed with the confident rhythm of work, replacing the echo of construction. The superstructures, once appearing a chaotic mass of metal, now looked harmonious, orderly, as if in their rightful places. And from somewhere deep within the hull occasionally came the first test hums of systems, quiet, like the awakening of a giant heart. And yet this final stage had another dimension, the human one. I saw in the workers' eyes a pride that was gentle and tired, like that of parents preparing to release their child into the big, difficult world. They knew, when the last tool was put away, when the final tests were passed, the ship would go out to sea already without their constant presence. And still, each of them understood that a piece of their labor would remain in this steel body forever. In the evenings, when the sun set beyond the horizon, coloring the James River in golden copper tones, I often stopped on the pier and looked at the aircraft carrier quietly swaying at the berth. In those moments, it reminded me of a huge beast that had already awakened, already stretched its muscles, but was still patiently waiting for the time to come to head into the open sea. And I knew that moment would come very soon. Thus, one chapter ended, and another began. The ship, born in the concrete canyons of the shipyard, raised by thousands of hands, having taken in the river's water for the first time, was now preparing for the day it would enter the ocean, where it would live its true life.